I am Maya, 32 years old, and somehow still standing after the people I called family tried to discard me like trash. As an acquisitions expert, I am used to dismantling toxic companies, but I never thought I would have to dismantle my own marriage. Last Friday, they ambushed me in my own living room. My mother-in-law shoved a pathetic settlement check in my face and told me to get out of her house. I just smiled and politely informed her that I had already sold the property to a developer and fired her golden child's son. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who they are dealing with. Growing up in South Atlanta, I learned early on that you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. I built my career in mergers and acquisitions through sheer willpower, eventually marrying Marcus Sterling. The Sterlings considered themselves the royalty of Atlanta high society. They ran Sterling Logistics, a legacy company passed down from Marcus' grandfather. For 5 years, I played the role of the perfect supportive wife, tolerating the constant passive-aggressive jabs from my mother-in-law Beatrice. She never missed a chance to remind me that my pedigree did not match their generational wealth. The ultimate betrayal unfolded on a Friday evening right in the middle of our custom-designed living room inside our $2.5 million Buckhead mansion. I had just walked down our grand sweeping staircase when I saw the divorce papers resting on the glass coffee table. Marcus was sitting on the velvet sofa, his legs crossed, looking completely unbothered. Right next to him, holding his hand, was Vanessa, his 24-year-old administrative assistant. Her slightly rounded stomach made it perfectly clear why she was sitting in my living room. Standing by the marble fireplace was Beatrice, her arms crossed and a smug, satisfied look on her face. Marcus did not even have the decency to stand up. He pointed at the papers and told me to sign them immediately. He claimed Vanessa was pregnant and needed a stress-free environment. Then he offered me a $50,000 buyout. He actually looked me in the eye and said that amount of money should be a fortune for a girl from the South Atlanta slums. He told me to pack a bag and leave the premises before midnight. Before I could even process the absolute audacity of his offer, Beatrice took a step forward. She tapped her diamond rings against the mantelpiece and sneered. She told me she had warned Marcus 5 years ago about marrying beneath his station. She called me a charity case, an outsider who forced her way into the elite circles of Atlanta. She said that no matter how many designer suits I bought with their money, I would never truly be a Sterling. She ordered me to take the settlement money and crawl back to the poverty I came from. As if this coordinated attack was not enough. Marcus' white brother-in-law, Connor, strolled out of my kitchen holding a glass of my most expensive bourbon. Connor is married to Marcus' sister Chloe, and he has always been a textbook opportunist, perfectly happy to leech off the Sterling family wealth while looking down on me. He took a sip of his drink and smirked, telling me not to bother fighting the divorce. He bragged that he and Marcus had already spoken to the corporate lawyers and completely frozen all of our joint bank accounts. Connor confidently stated that I did not have a single dime to hire legal representation and that I should just call a cab and disappear quietly. They all stood there waiting for me to break down, crying, waiting for me to beg. They genuinely believed I was a weak, dependent woman who relied entirely on their family name to survive. They thought I was a fragile little bird, but they completely forgot that my entire professional career involves tearing apart failing empires. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly walked over to the glass table, reached into my leather tote bag, and pulled out a thick, heavy legal file of my own. I dropped it right on top of their flimsy divorce petition. I looked Marcus dead in the eyes and told him I would gladly sign the divorce papers, but he seemed to have forgotten a minor legal detail. I reminded him about the massive gambling debt he racked up 3 years ago, the one he was so terrified his mother would find out about. I paid off that secret debt using my own private investment funds. In exchange for saving him from public ruin, the deed to this magnificent Buckhead mansion was legally transferred solely into my name. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace as she lunged forward to read the documents. I turned to Vanessa, who was suddenly looking very pale, and informed her that she would not be raising her baby in this house. I revealed that I had already sold the entire property to a luxury condominium developer that very morning. The funds were sitting safely in an offshore account, solely in my name. I smiled brightly and announced that the demolition bulldozers were scheduled to arrive at exactly 8 in the morning tomorrow. I told them they had exactly 12 hours to pack their designer clothes into garbage bags and vacate my property. Marcus shot up from the sofa, knocking over his drink. He yelled that I had no right to do this and that he was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar logistics company. Connor stepped up, puffing out his chest, threatening to use the entire weight of the Sterling corporate legal team to destroy me. I smiled, telling them to show up at the office tomorrow to see if their precious CEO still had a job there. At exactly 8, the ground in Buckhead shook. I stood on the pristine front lawn holding a cup of coffee, watching 3 bulldozers roll down the street. Their tracks chewed up the pavement. The volume of the diesel engines did exactly what I wanted, waking up the entire neighborhood. Curtains fluttered in the homes around us as the elite of Atlanta peeked out to witness the spectacle. Inside the mansion, chaos erupted. The heavy front door swung open, and Beatrice marched out wearing a silk robe and a sleeping mask pushed up on her forehead. Marcus was right behind her, looking disheveled and panicked. Beatrice was foaming at the mouth. She pointed a finger at the construction crew, screaming at them to turn off their machines. When the foreman ignored her and looked to me for instructions, she pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services, demanding the police send a squad car. She claimed a woman was trespassing on her property and threatening her family with machinery. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled into the driveway. Beatrice rushed down the steps, playing the role of the terrified matriarch. She demanded the officers arrest me, claiming I was a daughter-in-law trying to destroy a historic family property out of spite. Marcus stood behind her, nodding along, trying to look intimidating in his slippers. The lead officer walked over to me with his hand resting near his radio. I did not raise my voice or act defensive. I simply smiled and handed him a folder. Inside was the property deed bearing only my name, the bill of sale to the condo developer, and the demolition permits approved. The officer spent a minute reviewing the paperwork. Finally, he closed the folder, handed it back to me, and turned to Beatrice. He calmly informed her that the paperwork was ironclad. He stated that the property no longer belonged to the Sterling family and was now an active construction zone. He looked at Beatrice and Marcus, telling them that if they did not vacate the premises immediately, he would arrest them both for trespassing. Beatrice looked as if all the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Her jaw dropped and she gripped Marcus' arm to keep from collapsing on the grass. That was when Connor decided to make his grand entrance. My arrogant, opportunistic brother-in-law stormed out onto the porch, fully dressed and radiating unearned confidence. He puffed out his chest and marched down the steps, trying to use his booming voice to take control of the narrative. He pointed right at my face and threatened me with a defamation lawsuit, loudly proclaiming that I was making a mistake. He bragged that he was going to call the elite corporate lawyers at Sterling Logistics right this second. He promised he would use the company's infinite legal resources to freeze every single one of my personal bank accounts, bury me in endless litigation, and make sure I spent the rest of my life paying off his legal fees. He smirked, looking around at the police officers, as if he had just delivered a brilliant closing argument in a crowded courtroom. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee before I responded, laughing a genuine bright laugh that echoed across the lawn. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, tossing it directly at his chest. It fluttered to the ground, and Connor was forced to bend down and pick it up. It was a certified copy of the updated Sterling Logistics corporate bylaws. I watched the arrogant smirk melt entirely off his face as his eyes scanned the text. I kindly explained to Connor that because Marcus was such an incompetent executive, he had surrendered complete financial oversight to my firm 2 years ago, giving me full administrative authorization. I told Connor that at exactly midnight, I had permanently revoked their access to the corporate legal fund. They were completely locked out. They could not use a single penny of company money to fight me. They could not even afford a parking ticket, let alone a high-powered defense attorney. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The police officer checked his watch and loudly announced they had exactly 20 minutes to gather their essential items and get off the property. The ensuing panic was an absolute masterpiece to witness. Beatrice Marcus Connor. Chloe and the pregnant mistress Vanessa scrambled back into the doomed house. Because they had no time to organize proper luggage, and I had explicitly forbidden them from taking any of the expensive furniture, they were forced to pack their lives into heavy-duty black garbage bags provided by the construction crew. 20 minutes later, the proud elite Sterling family walked out of the front door, dragging plastic trash bags filled with wrinkled designer suits and expensive shoes. They looked ridiculous. They looked exactly like the trash they had treated me as for 5 long years. They stood on the curb, humiliated in front of their wealthy neighbors who were openly recording the entire scene on their phones. Because their luxury company cars were securely locked behind the gates of the corporate office, they had absolutely no way to leave the neighborhood. Connor was forced to swallow his pride and order a regular taxi. They all crammed into the back of a beat-up yellow cab, shoving their garbage bags into the trunk. Beatrice refused to look at me, keeping her face hidden behind her hands. As the yellow taxi sputtered and drove away down the long street, leaving a dark cloud of exhaust behind, I raised my coffee cup high in a silent, victorious toast. The heavy construction foreman looked over at me from his vehicle and gave a solid thumbs up, signaling he was ready to begin the demolition. I nodded, and the bulldozers began to roll forward, bringing down the walls of my past. The morning sun glared off the glass exterior of the Sterling Logistics headquarters as Marcus, Beatrice, and Connor marched through the revolving doors. They were still wearing the wrinkled clothes they had pulled from garbage bags just an hour earlier. Marcus practically kicked the lobby gates open, ignoring the confused stares of the receptionists. He was determined to use his 51% majority share to crush me and reverse everything I had done. Beatrice followed closely behind him, barking orders at the security guards to follow them upstairs. They squeezed into the executive elevator, completely blinded by their arrogance. When the elevator doors dinged open on the top floor, Marcus stormed down the executive hallway with his fists clenched tight. He kicked the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom wide open, expecting to find me sitting there alone and terrified. Instead, he froze in his tracks. The massive room was not empty. I was sitting comfortably at the head of the long, oval table, drinking a fresh glass of sparkling water. Flanking me on both sides were 5 ruthless Wall Street investors from Apex Capital, wearing immaculate tailored suits and staring back at Marcus with absolute cold indifference. Beatrice pushed past Marcus and immediately started screaming. She slammed her hands down on the polished mahogany table and demanded to know what I was doing in her precious family boardroom. She ordered the security guards who had followed them upstairs to grab my arms and physically throw me out of the building. She yelled that I was just a lowly employee and that this company belonged to the Sterling bloodline. Marcus chimed in, puffing out his chest and loudly reminding everyone in the room that he was the chief executive officer and that he held the ultimate voting power. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I calmly set my water glass down and gestured to the men sitting beside me. I politely introduced Marcus to the senior partners of Apex Capital. I explained that they had flown down from New York specifically for this emergency meeting. Connor laughed nervously from the doorway, crossing his arms. He sneered and told the investors that they were just wasting their time listening to a bitter ex-wife. Marcus smiled smugly and proudly declared that his 51% ownership meant he could veto absolutely any decision made in that room. I let his pathetic laughter echo off the glass walls for a few seconds before I made my move. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick-bound financial audit. I slid the heavy document across the smooth surface of the table, right until it hit Marcus directly in the chest. I told him to open to page 40. I watched the color completely drain from his face as his eyes scanned the highlighted numbers. I revealed to the entire room that Marcus had secretly lost millions of company funds in a series of disastrous offshore cryptocurrency investments. Beatrice gasped and looked at her son, demanding to know if what I was saying was true. Marcus stuttered, unable to form a coherent sentence. I did not give him a chance to lie. I explained loud and clear that 2 years ago, Marcus had panicked. He had taken out a massive, dangerous, high-interest corporate loan to quietly cover up his massive financial blunders before the annual shareholder meeting. He had used his 51% stake in Sterling Logistics as collateral for that secret loan. He thought he had successfully buried his mistakes behind closed corporate doors forever. Connor wiped sweat from his forehead, completely losing his arrogant posture. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I looked Marcus dead in the eye and revealed the best part of my plan. I told him that the anonymous private equity firm that purchased his massive debt from the original lenders was actually a shell company entirely controlled by my own mergers and acquisitions firm. I had personally owned his toxic debt for the last 18 months. I had been quietly holding the leash around his neck, just waiting for the perfect moment to pull it completely tight. Marcus began to visibly shake, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. I reminded him about the specific terms of his desperate loan agreement. The contract clearly stated that if the borrower missed 3 consecutive monthly payments, the debt would automatically convert into equity. I told Marcus that I had intentionally frozen his access to the corporate accounts yesterday, preventing him from making that critical third payment. The final deadline had officially passed at midnight. The Apex Capital investors nodded in unison, confirming the legal transfer of assets. The trap I had set had snapped shut perfectly today. Beatrice collapsed into a leather chair, clutching her chest as if she could not breathe. I stood up tall and smoothed out my jacket. I announced to the room that the debt conversion had completely diluted his shares. I formally declared that I now owned a 65% controlling interest in Sterling Logistics. I was now the unquestioned majority shareholder. I picked up a red stamped termination letter and tossed it gently onto the audit file. I informed Marcus that my very first act as the new majority owner was to officially terminate his employment, effective immediately right now. Marcus screamed and lunged forward, attempting to grab the documents. The Apex investors did not even blink. I calmly signaled the 2 security guards standing by the door. The very same guards Beatrice had brought up to remove me stepped forward and grabbed Marcus by both of his arms. They dragged him away from the table as he kicked and shouted my name. I sat back down in the large leather chair at the head of the boardroom table. I looked at Beatrice and Connor, telling them to get out of my building before I had them permanently arrested today. The heavy silence in the boardroom was suddenly broken by the sound of a slow, steady clap. I shifted my gaze to the doorway. Connor was standing there with a sickeningly triumphant grin spreading across his face. My opportunistic brother-in-law slowly walked into the room, clapping his hands together with deliberate, mocking exaggeration. He stepped right over Marcus, who was still desperately struggling against the tight grip of the massive security guards. Connor walked straight toward the head of the mahogany table. He reached out and pulled his wife Chloe into the room. Marcus' entitled younger sister had been hiding in the hallway the entire time, waiting for her moment to strike. She clung tightly to Connor's arm, wearing a stunning designer dress she had undoubtedly purchased using company funds. Chloe looked at me with the exact same elitist disgust her mother had perfected over the decades. They stood together, presenting a united front of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Connor stopped clapping and rested his hands on the back of a leather chair. He leaned forward and told me that I had just executed a truly spectacular hostile takeover. He complimented my strategy, calling it a textbook corporate coup. He said he was genuinely impressed that a girl from the South Atlanta slums had managed to outsmart her own husband and seize a 65% controlling interest in a legacy logistics empire. But then his smile twisted into something dark and vicious. He shook his head and clicked his tongue, acting like a disappointed teacher correcting a foolish student. He told me that my brilliant master plan had one fatal flaw. He asked me if I really thought he and Chloe were stupid enough to go down with a sinking ship. He asked if I honestly believed they would just sit around blindly while Marcus ran the family business into the ground with his reckless offshore cryptocurrency gambling. I kept my expression entirely neutral, but I felt a slight shift in the energy of the room. The Apex Capital investors sitting next to me stopped reviewing their documents and looked up at Connor. Connor proudly announced that he had been secretly monitoring the company financial decline for the past 6 months. He knew that the corporate accounts were bleeding out, and he knew that Marcus was dangerously close to defaulting on the Apex loan. So Connor decided to take matters into his own hands to protect his wife's inheritance. He looked right at me and dropped the bomb. He revealed that exactly 3 days ago, he and Chloe had used their executive access to initiate a massive wire transfer. They took every single penny of the company liquid cash reserves. They drained the operating accounts, the payroll funds, and the emergency backup capital. $15 million in liquid cash. Chloe chimed in with a shrill, superior laugh. She bragged that they did not just move the money to another domestic bank, where my lawyers could easily find it. She proudly stated that they wired the entire $15 million directly into an impenetrable private family trust located in the Cayman Islands, a trust legally registered solely under the name of their infant son. Connor nodded, confirming her statement. He boasted that the Cayman Islands had the strictest banking secrecy laws on the planet. He told me that no United States court, no divorce lawyer, and certainly no corporate auditor could ever touch that money without spending a decade entangled in international litigation. He looked around the grand boardroom, gesturing to the expensive artwork and the panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline. He mocked me, telling me that I had just fought tooth and nail to inherit a completely bankrupt empty shell of a company. Connor practically vibrated with malicious joy. He explained that without that $15 million in operating capital, Sterling Logistics could not pay its truck drivers tomorrow. The company could not refuel its massive fleet of transport vehicles. It could not pay the warehouse workers or cover the insurance premiums. He told me that within 48 hours, the entire supply chain would freeze. The massive corporate contracts would be breached. The vendors would sue, and the company would be forced to file for federal bankruptcy. He looked at the Apex Capital investors and laughed, telling them they had just backed the wrong horse. He said their new equity was entirely worthless. Then Connor presented his ultimatum. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single crumpled dollar bill. He tossed it onto the boardroom table so it slid right to my fingertips. He demanded that I sign over my 65% equity to him right now in exchange for that one single dollar. He promised that if I surrendered my shares, he would generously wire the $15 million back into the corporate accounts and save the company from immediate ruin. He told me I had exactly 5 minutes to decide before he walked out that door and let me take the public fall for destroying a 60-year-old Atlanta legacy. Beatrice suddenly found her second wind, laughing hysterically from the corner of the room. Marcus stopped struggling against the guards, a wide, manic smile breaking across his face as he realized his brother-in-law had seemingly saved them all. They all stared at me, expecting me to panic. They wanted to see me sweat. They wanted to see the realization of my total defeat wash over my face as I was backed completely into a corner. I looked at the crumpled dollar bill sitting on the polished wood. I looked at Chloe's smug face and Connor's victorious stance. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch out until the tension in the room was suffocating. Then I did the one thing they never expected. I smiled a very genuine, bright smile. I then calmly reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped a button on my phone screen and connected my device to the projector mounted on the boardroom wall. The logo of Sterling Logistics vanished from the display and was instantly replaced by a live feed of a banking portal. It was the exact offshore account portal for the Cayman Islands Trust that Connor had just been boasting about. To the room I watched as Connor's eyes darted up to the glowing screen. The satisfaction completely drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of horror. Displayed in numbers right in the center of the projection was the total account balance. It read, $0. Chloe gasped and stumbled backward, clutching her designer handbag as if someone had struck her. She looked frantically at Connor, demanding to know what was going on and ask where their $15 million had gone. Connor could not answer her. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and fixed in terror on the glowing zero on the screen. He kept muttering that it was impossible and that the laws in the Cayman Islands were impenetrable by outside force. He insisted that no one could have touched that stolen money without years of legal authorization. I set my phone face down on the mahogany table and leaned back in my chair. I explained to Connor that he was right about the offshore banking secrecy laws being strict for domestic lawsuits. However, I told him, those banks are cooperative and transparent when they are dealing with the United States government. I reminded him that my career was built on handling corporate mergers and acquisitions. I had spent a decade anticipating how desperate executives would try to strip assets from failing companies right before a takeover occurred. I knew exactly what moves they were going to make before they even formulated the thought. I revealed to the stunned room that the very moment my cybersecurity team detected his unauthorized $15 million wire transfer, I did not call a divorce lawyer or a corporate mediator. Instead, I made a direct phone call to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I politely informed the investors that I had officially flagged his massive offshore transfer as a highly suspicious act of international money laundering and federal wire fraud, because the transfer involved an offshore tax haven and was illegally initiated during an active corporate takeover. The federal authorities did not hesitate to intervene. I announced that the United States government had officially frozen the entire Cayman Islands trust account at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. The gravity of the situation slammed into Connor like a freight train. He was no longer dealing with a corporate boardroom dispute or a family divorce settlement. He had just walked himself into a massive federal crime with maximum penalties. I looked at him and laid out the legal consequences of his actions. I told him that the federal authorities were already reviewing the digital signatures on the transfer documents he submitted. I explained that federal prosecutors do not take kindly to executives who attempt to hide millions of dollars across international borders to avoid paying their debt obligations. I told Connor that he was looking at several decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and international money laundering. The color vanished from Connor's face, leaving him looking pale, sweaty, and sick. His breathing became rapid and erratic as the reality of federal prison materialized in his mind. He looked around the room like a trapped animal, searching for any escape route from the mess he created. His panicked eyes landed on Marcus, who was still standing near the security guards watching the disaster unfold in shock. In an instant, Connor's demeanor shifted from superiority to desperate, pathetic self-preservation. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus' chest and began shouting at the top of his lungs. Connor told the Apex Capital investors and the security guards that the entire offshore transfer was actually Marcus' idea. He yelled that Marcus was the chief executive officer and that Marcus had explicitly authorized the movement of those funds to hide them from the new auditors. He threw his own brother-in-law entirely under the bus without a single moment of hesitation. He pleaded with the room, claiming he was just an employee following direct orders from the head of the company, and that he had nothing to do with the criminal intent behind the money laundering scheme. Marcus reacted to the betrayal with pure, explosive rage. He broke free from the security guards holding him and lunged toward Connor, screaming that he was a filthy liar. Marcus denied having any knowledge of the Cayman Islands account and accused Connor of stealing the corporate money to fund his own lavish lifestyle with Chloe. He yelled that Connor was a parasite who had been leeching off the Sterling family name since the day he married into it. Chloe started screaming at Marcus, defending her husband and demanding that Marcus take responsibility for ruining all of their lives. The atmosphere of this boardroom completely shattered into a loud, violent screaming match. The two men who had just stood together, united in their arrogance against me, were now tearing each other apart to save their own skin from federal prison. They shoved past each other, cursing and throwing wild criminal accusations as they stumbled out of the doors and into the executive hallway. I sat in my chair and quietly watched them destroy each other completely. The security guards followed them out to prevent a physical brawl. I could hear their voices echoing down the corridor as they spilled into the main lobby. The sounds of their arguing drifted back into the boardroom as they turned on each other in front of the corporate staff. The elite Sterling men were destroying their own legacy much better than I ever could. Beatrice did not slink away into the shadows after the boardroom disaster. That is not how a woman who spent 40 years clawing her way to the top of Atlanta high society operates. While Marcus and Connor were busy hiring cheap defense attorneys to keep themselves out of federal prison, Beatrice went straight to the one place where she still held absolute power: the social elite. She knew that in our world, reputation is currency, and she was determined to bankrupt mine. The very next afternoon, she crashed an exclusive charity luncheon at the Piedmont Driving Club. This was a gathering of the wealthiest and most influential power brokers in the city. Beatrice walked into that dining room wearing her finest pearls and carrying a perfectly folded lace handkerchief. She did not yell or cause a scene. Instead, she played the role of the devastated, heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. She sat at the head table, surrounded by generational wealth, and began to spin a web of vicious, fabricated lies. She told the prominent doctors, lawyers, and investors that I was a criminal mastermind who had manipulated her foolish son. She claimed with fake tears streaming down her face that I had embezzled millions of dollars from Sterling Logistics to fund my own private firm. But Beatrice did not stop at financial accusations. She knew that high society thrives on scandalous gossip. She lowered her voice and confided in the room that the real reason for the divorce was my rampant infidelity. She told them I had been sleeping with rival executives to secure corporate secrets. She painted me as a ruthless, immoral predator who had taken advantage of a generous family to steal their 60-year-old legacy. Her performance was a masterpiece of social manipulation. Because the Sterling name held decades of respect, the elite circle swallowed every single lie without questioning a thing. The fallout was almost instantaneous. By 2 in the afternoon, I was sitting in my new executive office reviewing operational budgets when my phone began to ring. It was not Marcus or his lawyers. It was my clients. In the world of mergers and acquisitions, public relations is everything. Investors do not want their money tied to a woman accused of embezzlement and corporate espionage. My first call was from the CEO of a major tech firm whose acquisition I had been negotiating for 3 months. He sounded cold and distant. He told me that rumors were circulating through the country club circuit and that his board of directors was extremely uncomfortable with the negative press. He threatened to pull his $20 million contract by the end of the week if the situation was not resolved. Over the next 2 hours, I fielded 5 more calls, just like that one. My entire professional reputation, the career I had built from nothing with my own 2 hands, was actively crumbling. Beatrice was methodically destroying my livelihood using nothing but whispers and champagne flutes. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office looking out over the city. I had secured the company, but Beatrice was proving that corporate equity meant nothing if I lost all of my clients. As I calculated the total potential losses, my phone buzzed with a text message. I picked it up and opened the notification. It was from Beatrice. She had sent me a photograph. In the picture, she was sitting on a sunlit country club patio, holding a crystal champagne flute. Sitting right next to her, smiling warmly for the camera, was Richard Hughes. He was the head of the largest venture capital firm in the Southeast, and he happened to be my single most important client. The caption underneath the photo was short and dripping with venom. It read that I might be able to steal a business through dirty legal tricks, but she owned the city. She wanted me to know that she could snap her fingers and leave me with absolutely nothing. I stared at the photograph for a long time. My initial instinct was to call her and scream, but I knew that would only give her the satisfaction of knowing her strategy was working. Beatrice was trying to draw me into a public mudslinging contest where her decades of social connections would easily overpower my logical defense. She wanted me to panic and beg for a truce. She thought I would trade the company back to her in exchange for my professional reputation. I set the phone face down on my desk and took a deep, steadying breath. I realized in that moment that securing financial control of Sterling Logistics was only the first half of the battle. Beatrice's social armor was her ultimate weapon. As long as the elite of Atlanta believed her facade, she would never stop hunting me. She would poison every deal, every contract, and every relationship I tried to build. I could not just defeat her in the boardroom. I had to dismantle her entirely in the exact same social arena where she felt untouchable. I had to strip away her pearls, her pride, and her standing. I looked back out at the Atlanta skyline. Beatrice thought she owned this city because she attended expensive luncheons and smiled for the cameras. She forgot that I am the one who audits the bank accounts behind those expensive smiles. I knew the dark financial secrets of half the people sitting at her country club tables, including her own. If she wanted to play a high-stakes game of reputation destruction, I was more than ready to oblige. I sat back down at my desk and opened a highly secured encrypted file on my computer. It was time to show the elite circles of Atlanta exactly who they were dealing with. She wanted to play the queen, so I decided to publicly take her crown. The real war for absolute control of this city was finally starting right now. 3 days later, the annual Atlanta Heritage Gala took place at the Biltmore Hotel. This event was the pinnacle of high society for the city elite. It was a night of champagne silk gowns and million-dollar pledges. Beatrice Sterling arrived wearing a custom silver gown, acting like the undisputed queen of the ballroom. She spent the cocktail hour holding court among influential politicians and business leaders. She continued to spin her tragic narrative, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, telling everyone how bravely she was fighting to save her family from a thieving daughter-in-law. Beatrice was smug because she was scheduled to receive the prestigious Philanthropist of the Year award. She believed this award would cement her status as an untouchable saint and validate every lie she had spread about me. She stood near the main stage, waiting for her grand moment. At 8 o'clock, the heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom swung open. I walked into the room wearing a breathtaking emerald green designer gown that commanded absolute attention. The bustling conversations near the entrance immediately died down into hushed whispers as people turned to stare. I walked with my head held high, projecting total authority. Beatrice spotted me from across the room, and her fake smile instantly vanished. Her face twisted into a mask of pure rage. She immediately snapped her fingers and signaled two burly security guards pointing frantically in my direction. She demanded that they remove the uninvited trespasser from the premises. She yelled that I was a criminal who had no business breathing the same air as the respected members of the foundation. The security guards began to march toward me, ready to physically drag me out. Before the guards could reach me, the foundation director stepped up to the main microphone on the brightly lit stage. He tapped the microphone, sending a sharp ringing sound echoing across the massive ballroom. He asked everyone to direct their attention to the front of the room. Beatrice smugly smoothed down her silver dress and took a step toward the stage, expecting to hear her name called for the philanthropy award. The director cleared his throat and announced that the foundation had actually been facing a catastrophic financial crisis over the past several months. He revealed to the shocked crowd that the charity was on the brink of permanent closure due to a severe lack of funded donations. However, his voice lifted with excitement as he announced that a miracle had occurred just 24 hours ago. He told the silent room that an anonymous mega donor had stepped forward and wired enough liquid cash to fully fund the foundation operations for the next decade. The director smiled broadly and asked the crowd to give a massive round of applause to the true savior of the Atlanta Heritage Foundation. He pointed straight past Beatrice and called out my name, Maya Caldwell. A bright white spotlight swung across the dark ballroom and landed perfectly on me. The security guards, who were just seconds away from grabbing my shoulders, immediately froze and took two respectful steps backward. Beatrice froze mid-step, her jaw literally dropping as the entire ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. I smiled graciously, acknowledging the clapping crowd, and walked slowly toward the stage. Beatrice tried to block my path, hissing under her breath that this was impossible and demanding to know what dirty trick I was playing. I ignored her, gliding right past her frozen figure and gracefully ascending the stairs. The director handed me the microphone and stepped back, allowing me to take total control of the room. I looked out at the sea of wealthy, elite faces, the very same people Beatrice had been lying to all week. I thanked the director for his kind words and spoke about the profound importance of genuine philanthropy. I kept my voice incredibly polite, soft, and deadly. I told the audience that before I committed my multi-million-dollar donation, I utilized my professional expertise as a corporate auditor to perform a deep dive into the foundation financial history. I wanted to ensure their ledgers were clean. I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the massive room. I looked directly down at Beatrice, who was standing at the foot of the stage looking pale and terrified. I announced to the entire elite society of Atlanta that my audit uncovered a very disturbing trend of performative generosity. I revealed clearly and loudly that the highly respected Sterling family had not actually contributed a single dime to this foundation in over 5 years. The crowd gasped in unison. I explained that every single massive public pledge Beatrice had made at this very gala year after year had quietly bounced due to insufficient funds. I told the room that Beatrice had been using this charity as a free publicity stunt, hiding behind a facade of wealth while her bank accounts were entirely empty. I politely suggested that before anyone listens to vicious rumors spread by a woman desperate to hide her own financial ruin, they might want to check if her checks actually clear the bank. The backlash was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The polite applause vanished, replaced by aggressive murmurs and harsh, judgmental stares directed entirely at Beatrice. In the world of high society, there is no greater sin than being exposed as a broke fraud who fakes charity donations. The very people who had been drinking champagne with her just an hour ago physically took steps away from her as if poverty were contagious. Beatrice stood completely alone, isolated in the middle of the crowded ballroom. Her prestigious social armor did not just crack, it completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked up at me with tears of ultimate humiliation welling in her eyes. I simply smiled, nodded my head in a polite dismissal, and handed the microphone back to the director. I walked off the stage, leaving the former queen of Atlanta high society to drown in the absolute ruin of her own public lies. The swift and brutal dismantling of Beatrice at the charity gala left the Sterling family in absolute ruins. They were entirely cut off from their generational wealth and forced to live out of a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of Atlanta. For a woman like Vanessa, who had carefully calculated her affair with Marcus to secure a lifetime of luxury, this new reality was completely unacceptable. She quickly realized that her golden meal ticket had expired, and the lavish lifestyle she had been promised was gone forever. Furious and desperate, she decided to take matters into her own hands. 2 days after the gala, I was sitting in my newly renovated executive suite reviewing the final restructuring documents for the company. The heavy glass doors of my office suddenly burst open. Vanessa marched past my bewildered executive assistant, breathing heavily and clutching a cheap designer knockoff bag. Her face was flushed with anger, and she looked completely unhinged. She slammed her hands down on my pristine desk and demanded my immediate attention. My security team rushed in right behind her, ready to physically remove her from the premises, but I calmly raised my hand and signaled for them to stand down. I wanted to hear exactly what Marcus' fake pregnant mistress had to say. Vanessa leaned over my desk and launched into a frantic, vicious tirade. She told me that because I had stolen the company and frozen all of Marcus' assets, she was now suffering in a miserable, filthy motel room. She claimed the stress of the eviction was destroying her health and her future. Then she dropped her ultimate threat. She told me she had already drafted a horrific story for the local tabloid media. She threatened to go to the press and publicly claim that I had hired thugs to physically assault her during the eviction process. She said she would tell the world that the trauma and abuse I orchestrated directly caused her to suffer a tragic miscarriage. She smiled a wicked, greedy smile and told me that the resulting media circus would permanently destroy my professional reputation and tank the company's stock. She demanded that I wire $2 million into her personal bank account by the end of the day, or she would release the fabricated story to every news outlet in the city. I sat back in my leather chair and let her finish her pathetic extortion attempt. I did not show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. Instead, I slowly shook my head and sighed. I told Vanessa that her strategy was incredibly lazy and deeply flawed. I reached over to my computer keyboard and tapped a single button. The large flat-screen monitor mounted on my office wall instantly flickered to life. I invited Vanessa to turn around and take a very close look at the video playing on the screen. The high-definition security footage clearly showed the VIP section of an exclusive underground nightclub in downtown Atlanta. The timestamp in the corner proved the video was recorded at 2 in the morning just last night. The camera zoomed in perfectly on Vanessa. She was wearing a skin-tight dress, standing on top of a leather booth, and aggressively taking multiple shots of top-shelf tequila while dancing with two strange men. I watched the color completely drain from her face as she stared at the screen in absolute horror. She stood frozen, staring at undeniable proof of her own reckless behavior. I folded my hands on the desk and kindly explained to Vanessa that top-tier corporate auditors do not just investigate bank accounts. We also investigate human liabilities, and she was a massive liability to my former husband. I told her that I had hired elite private investigators to follow her every single move the moment Marcus handed me those divorce papers. I revealed that I knew her entire pregnancy was a complete scam. She had fabricated the whole medical condition just to trap Marcus into a quick marriage and secure a piece of the Sterling family fortune. I told her that if she even thought about going to the press with her ridiculous miscarriage story, I would personally hand this nightclub footage over to the media, the police, and Marcus himself. Vanessa began to physically tremble. Her grand extortion plan had completely evaporated in less than 60 seconds. She realized she had walked into a trap and had absolutely zero leverage left. She looked at the floor, her shoulders slumping in total defeat. She muttered that she was entirely broke and had no way to survive now that Marcus was ruined. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk. I told Vanessa that she was actually in luck because I was feeling remarkably generous today. I told her I had no interest in destroying a desperate 24-year-old girl, but I did have a highly lucrative business proposition for her. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills, dropping $10,000 in cold, hard cash right onto the desk. Vanessa stared at the money with wide, hungry eyes. I told her the cash was hers to keep free and clear to start a new life far away from Atlanta. But in exchange, I needed something very specific from her. I knew that Marcus was incredibly paranoid and used a secret prepaid burner phone to conduct his shady offshore business deals with Connor. I knew Vanessa shared the motel room with Marcus and had easy access to his personal belongings. I told her I would give her the $10,000 right now if she handed over Marcus' secret burner phone today. Vanessa did not even hesitate for a single second. The loyalty she had for Marcus vanished the moment she saw the stack of cash. She eagerly dug her manicured hands into her cheap tote bag and pulled out a small black, untraceable cell phone. She tossed it onto my desk without a shred of remorse. She greedily snatched the $10,000, shoving the cash deep into her purse. She turned around and practically ran out of my office, eager to escape the sinking ship of the Sterling family forever. I picked up the black burner phone and smiled, feeling the weight of the evidence in my hand. Vanessa had just sold out Marcus' entire criminal enterprise for pennies, and she had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy Connor and Chloe next. I sat in my quiet office holding Marcus' new black burner phone, turning it over in my hands. Vanessa had just handed me the master key to the Sterling family downfall for a mere $10,000. I immediately called in my lead cybersecurity expert, a brilliant guy who specializes in corporate espionage recovery. It took him less than 20 minutes to bypass the cheap encryption Marcus had installed. As the text messages, emails, and encrypted chat logs populated on my large office monitor, I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and started reading. Marcus and Connor had been communicating for months, plotting to siphon funds and hide their tracks. But as I dug deeper into the hidden files, I found something that actually made me pause. Connor, the arrogant white knight who constantly bragged about his superior intellect, was not just planning to steal from the company. He was planning to completely destroy his own wife. I opened a subfolder hidden deep in the phone memory containing the original establishment documents for the Cayman Islands Private Family Trust. This was the exact same trust Connor had proudly boasted about draining our $15 million into. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the international wire authorization forms. Connor had not signed his own name. He had forged Chloe's signature on every single page. His backup plan was impressively cowardly. Connor knew moving $15 million to an offshore tax haven was a massive federal crime. He knew that the IRS and FBI would eventually track the digital footprint. So he deliberately set up the account solely under Chloe's name, using forged power of attorney documents. He made sure that when the federal agents came knocking with arrest warrants, they would be looking exclusively for her. Connor fully intended to let his entitled, spoiled wife take the absolute fall and rot in a federal penitentiary for decades, while he played the victim and walked away clean. Chloe had spent years treating me like I was dirt beneath her designer shoes. But even I had to admit, this level of betrayal from her own husband was stunning. I knew I could not just hand this evidence over to the authorities. That would be too easy and far too quiet. The Sterling family needed to tear themselves apart from the inside out. They needed to feel the exact same betrayal they had inflicted on me. I printed out high-resolution color copies of every single forged document. I highlighted the fake signatures and attached a printed transcript of a text message exchange where Connor explicitly bragged to Marcus about making sure Chloe was the sole legal target for the feds. I placed all of the evidence into a thick manila envelope and sealed it tight. I called a highly discreet private anonymous courier service and gave them very specific delivery instructions. They were to deliver it directly into her hands. Across town, the elite Sterling family was currently experiencing the harsh reality of their new life. My private investigators were monitoring the cheap roadside motel where they had been forced to relocate. They were gathered in a cramped, dingy motel room, trying to have a pathetic family dinner out of cheap styrofoam takeout containers. The tension in that tiny room must have been suffocating. Beatrice was likely complaining about the smell of the carpet while Marcus and Connor were probably still pointing fingers at each other over the frozen offshore funds. Chloe was undoubtedly whining about her ruined social life, the loss of her luxury cars, and demanding that Connor fix the situation immediately. They had no idea that a courier was pulling into the flickering neon-lit parking lot at that exact moment. The courier walked up the exterior concrete stairs and knocked loudly on their peeling painted door. Marcus answered, assuming it was just another motel guest complaining about the noise. Instead, the courier handed a heavy manila envelope directly to Chloe, who was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress. The courier turned and walked away without saying a single word. Chloe frowned, inspecting the blank envelope. She probably thought it was a legal notice from one of the country club vendors demanding unpaid membership dues. She ripped open the seal and pulled out the thick stack of papers. I sat quietly at my desk, miles away, watching the live feed from the private investigator parked across the street. Through the thin motel curtains, the investigator camera captured the exact moment Chloe's world stopped spinning. She stared down at the highlighted bank transfers and the blatant forgeries of her own handwriting. She read the printed text messages where the man she married coldly calculated exactly how many years in federal prison she would serve so he could avoid prosecution. Chloe had always believed Connor was her ultimate protector, a wealthy, sophisticated man who elevated her status. She thought they were equal partners in their elitist crimes. Now she was holding undeniable physical proof that she was nothing more than his disposable human shield. The illusion of her perfect aristocratic marriage completely evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. I watched the live feed as Chloe's hands began to violently shake. The styrofoam takeout container rested forgotten on her lap as she slowly looked up from the papers and locked her eyes directly on Connor. He was standing near the motel room window, chewing on a cheap plastic fork, completely oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated inside his wife's hands. Chloe slowly stood up from the mattress, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The fake, sophisticated grace she had practiced for decades vanished completely, replaced by the raw, vicious reality of a woman who realizes she is about to be caged for a crime she did not commit. She clutched the papers in her hands so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The absolute storm was finally breaking. Chloe stared at the forged documents in her trembling hands. The cheap styrofoam takeout container slid off her lap and spilled cold, greasy food onto the stained motel carpet, but she did not even notice. She stood up slowly and walked toward Connor, who was still staring out the window, chewing on a plastic fork. She shoved the heavy stack of papers directly into his chest. He stumbled back, completely caught off guard, as the pages fluttered to the floor around his feet. She demanded to know if he had really forged her signature to make her the sole target of a federal money laundering investigation. Connor tried to play dumb at first. He put his hands up and used his smooth, calm voice, the one he always used to manipulate her and everyone else in their elite social circle. He told her there was a massive misunderstanding and that he was just trying to protect their family assets from my corporate takeover. Chloe did not buy a single word of his pathetic excuses. She pointed at the highlighted text messages where he explicitly bragged about letting her take the fall and rot in federal prison. She screamed at him at the top of her lungs, calling him a coward and a complete fraud. The cramped, dingy motel room could no longer contain her blistering fury. Chloe grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the cheap laminate dresser and hurled it right at his head. It missed him by an inch and shattered into a dozen pieces against the thin drywall. Connor panicked. His calm, sophisticated facade completely evaporated. He bolted out the door, ran down the exterior concrete stairs, and practically threw himself into the small, poorly lit lobby of the motel. Chloe chased right after him, screaming obscenities that echoed across the parking lot. Marcus and Beatrice rushed out of the room right behind them, trying desperately to stop the madness before it attracted too much attention. Down in the lobby, Chloe completely lost her mind. She grabbed a tall metal display rack full of tourist brochures and shoved it violently to the floor, sending pamphlets scattering everywhere. She cornered Connor against the front reception desk, hitting his chest and shoulders with her fists. She yelled that he was supposed to be her partner, but he was perfectly fine letting her spend decades in a federal penitentiary while he planned to spend her family money on a beach somewhere. The motel clerk ducked behind the counter, terrified, and reaching for the telephone, while other guests opened their doors to watch the chaotic scene unfold. Beatrice hurried into the lobby, clutching her silk robe tightly around her body. She looked around at the staring motel guests, and absolute panic set in. Even now, facing total financial ruin and federal investigations, her obsession with public image kicked in immediately. She rushed forward and grabbed Chloe by the arm, hissing at her to lower her voice. She told her daughter to stop acting like a common street thug and to remember that she was a sterling. That was the absolute wrong thing to say. Chloe violently yanked her arm away from her mother. She turned all of her unhinged, blistering rage directly onto Beatrice. She screamed that there was no sterling legacy left to protect. Then Chloe dropped the ultimate bombshell. She yelled so loudly that every single person in the lobby could hear her perfectly. She exposed that Beatrice had known for years that Connor was running shady shell companies and engaging in highly questionable business practices. She revealed that Beatrice had deliberately looked the other way and pushed for the marriage simply because Connor came from a wealthy white pedigree. Beatrice cared more about having a country club-approved son-in-law than she cared about her own daughter's safety and financial security. Beatrice's face turned chalk white. She raised her hands and tried to deny it, but Chloe kept screaming. She called her mother a social climbing hypocrite who happily sold her own daughter to a white-collar con artist just to look good in front of her elitist high society friends. Marcus tried to intervene and separate the two women, but Chloe shoved him away. She told her brother that he was just as pathetic for letting his ex-wife steal their 60-year-old logistics company right out from under him. The pristine, aristocratic image of the elite Sterling family completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the dirty linoleum floor of a two-star motel. They were reduced to screaming, scratching, and tearing each other apart like wild animals turning on their own blood out of pure desperation and greed. Directly across the busy street, I sat comfortably at a small wrought iron outdoor table of a late-night cafe. I was wearing a warm, elegant trench coat and holding a freshly brewed espresso in both of my hands. The large glass windows of the motel lobby provided a perfect, unobstructed cinematic view of the absolute destruction I had orchestrated. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark flavor coat my tongue as the cool night air brushed against my face. I watched through the glass as Connor tried to shield his head, while Chloe threw a heavy brass bell from the reception desk right at him. I watched Beatrice desperately trying to hide her face from the onlookers, who were openly recording the entire violent meltdown on their cell phones. It was a beautiful masterpiece of undeniable karma. They had spent 5 years treating me like I was uncultured, and beneath them simply because I grew up in South Atlanta. Yet here they were acting like absolute fools in public, destroying whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left. I did not feel a single drop of guilt or pity. They were simply facing the exact consequences of their own toxic arrogance. I set my espresso cup down on the table, just as the shrill sound of approaching sirens pierced the quiet night. 2 police cruisers came skidding into the motel parking lot with their blue and red lights flashing wildly, illuminating the motel walls. I watched with pure satisfaction as 4 armed police officers rushed into the lobby to forcefully break up the domestic disturbance. The elite Sterling family was about to spend their night in the back of a squad car. I paid my bill, left a generous tip for the barista, and walked away into the night feeling absolutely untouchable. The police hauled Chloe and Connor out of the motel lobby while Beatrice tried to hide her face from the flashing cameras of the other guests. Beatrice knew her aristocratic image was completely dead in Atlanta. The public spectacle was a fatal blow to her pride, but she was not a woman who surrendered easily. She was cornered, terrified, and highly motivated. She desperately needed massive amounts of liquid cash to hire top-tier criminal defense attorneys for herself and Marcus. Furthermore, her massive ego convinced her she needed seed money to launch a rival logistics startup. She wanted to crush me in the corporate sector and violently reclaim her throne as the undisputed queen of the city. She had one last pristine asset completely untouched by my corporate audits. It was a historic $5 million vacation estate in Savannah, Georgia. The property was a sprawling antebellum mansion surrounded by ancient weeping willows and Spanish moss. It was the absolute crown jewel of her personal real estate portfolio, a place where she used to host lavish summer parties for the Southern elite. To avoid the local tabloids catching wind of her total financial desperation, she listed the property entirely off-market through a highly discreet luxury broker. She demanded a completely anonymous cash buyer who could close the transaction within 48 hours. As a seasoned acquisitions expert actively monitoring her every financial move, I saw the private listing the very second it hit the broker-exclusive server. I immediately instructed my wealth management team to create a blind shell company. We offered her an all-cash expedited closing, but we attached a brutally insulting discount to the proposal. We offered exactly $2 million for a property worth more than double that amount. Because the walls of federal prison were rapidly closing in around her son, and her own bank accounts were thoroughly frozen, she swallowed her immense pride. She eagerly took the bait without asking a single question about the buyer identity. 3 days later, Beatrice sat inside a plush mahogany conference room at a prestigious downtown Atlanta real estate law firm. She was wearing oversized dark sunglasses and a vintage Chanel suit, desperately trying to cling to the fragile illusion of her former power. She gripped an expensive silver fountain pen and aggressively signed her name across the final stack of property deeds. She leaned back in her high-backed leather chair and smugly told her real estate attorney that this minor financial setback was absolutely nothing. She loudly bragged that the Sterling bloodline always bounces back from adversity. She promised the room that with this $2 million in untraceable cash, she was going to fund a brand new corporate empire, hire a fleet of ruthless litigators, and personally ensure that I spent the rest of my miserable life working a minimum wage job in the slums. She forcefully pushed the signed deed across the polished table, demanding her wire transfer confirmation immediately. The managing partner of the law firm collected the papers and cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. He politely informed Beatrice that the anonymous buyer had actually requested to hand-deliver the final confirmation documents in person to finalize the sale. Right on cue, I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the conference room and confidently stepped inside. I was wearing a perfectly tailored ivory business suit, holding a fresh cup of artisan espresso in my hand. I walked straight up to the conference table, smiled warmly down at her, and told her it was an absolute pleasure doing business today. Beatrice ripped off her sunglasses, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror as her brain violently struggled to process my presence in the room. She looked frantically at her attorney, demanding to know what kind of sick joke this was. She ordered him to tear up the contracts immediately. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso and set the official wire transfer receipt right in front of her shaking hands. I kindly explained that my private equity firm was the sole proprietor of the blind shell company she just sold her precious legacy estate to. I told her the absolute best part of the entire transaction was where the money actually came from. I revealed that I did not even use my own personal savings to buy her historic Savannah mansion. I used the exact first quarter corporate dividends from the 65% share of Sterling Logistics that I had just legally stripped away from her son. I bought her prized family estate using her own stolen company profits. Beatrice began to hyperventilate, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the edge of the mahogany table. I leaned down, resting my hands on the table so we were perfectly eye level. I told her she had just permanently signed away her most prized generational asset to the very woman she constantly called a low-class charity case. I thanked her sincerely for the incredible discount. I let her know I was planning to completely gut the historic interior of her beloved vacation home and turn it into a modern corporate retreat center for my diverse, newly promoted executive team. She let out a guttural scream of pure fury and lunged across the table, trying to physically rip the signed deed out of the attorney's hands. The lawyer swiftly pulled the legal documents out of her reach and stepped backward. He coldly informed her that the transaction was officially complete and legally binding under Georgia state law. She had already accepted the wire transfer, and there was absolutely no going back. I turned around and walked out of the glass conference room, leaving Beatrice screaming in absolute agony. Her shrieks echoed down the quiet legal hallway as the crushing reality washed over her. She realized she had just funded my luxury real estate portfolio entirely out of her own blind arrogance and desperation. Marcus watched his mother return to their miserable motel room completely broken. Beatrice walked through the peeling doorway with shaking hands and collapsed onto the sagging mattress. She confessed she just sold their historic Savannah estate directly to me. The realization that I used their stolen profits to buy her prized generational asset pushed Marcus past the point of rational thought. Stripped of his aristocratic pride, he decided that if he could not rule the company, he would burn my entire empire to the ground. He suddenly remembered a hidden technical vulnerability from his time as the chief executive officer. 3 years ago, he demanded the IT department install a secret backdoor portal into the corporate servers to quietly monitor employee emails. He was certain my new cybersecurity team had not found that outdated backdoor yet. Late that night, Marcus parked a rented sedan in the dark alleyway behind my corporate headquarters. The glass building towered above him as a glowing symbol of the power I had taken from his family. He sat illuminated by the harsh blue light of his laptop screen. He typed his old credentials and initiated the remote breach, bypassing the security firewall with surprising ease. A wicked smile spread across his face as he gained access to the internal network. He immediately targeted my most sensitive assets, going straight for my private mergers and acquisitions client portfolios. These files contained highly confidential financial records, upcoming buyout strategies, and proprietary corporate secrets. That specific data was worth tens of millions of dollars to my biggest corporate rivals. Marcus intended to download the database and sell it to the highest bidder the next morning. He thought he was executing a flawless act of corporate espionage. He was absolutely wrong. The second Marcus pinged the outdated backdoor portal, a massive red alert flashed across the monitors in my private security hub. I was sitting in my penthouse sipping chamomile tea when my lead cybersecurity director called my cell phone. He informed me someone was trying to breach the mainframe using an old executive password. I opened my secure laptop and watched the live feed of the intrusion. My director asked if he should terminate the connection and dispatch the Atlanta police to the IP address. I took a slow sip of tea and smiled at the screen. I told him to hold the police and leave the back door wide open. Arresting Marcus for a simple failed hacking attempt was far too quiet and boring. I wanted him to suffer a spectacular public humiliation. I instructed my team to isolate his connection and quarantine him in a fake digital sandbox. Then I ordered them to feed him a custom-built decoy file. My tech team rapidly compiled a data folder labeled as the Master Client Acquisition Roster. The folder did not contain a shred of actual financial data. Instead, we loaded it with aggressive tracking software and a devastating corporate ransomware program. We placed the poisoned file right in front of Marcus' digital footsteps. I watched the progress bar on my screen as Marcus eagerly downloaded the massive file directly onto his personal hard drive. When the download reached 100%, he abruptly severed the connection and drove away, completely convinced he had just stolen the keys to my kingdom. I closed my laptop and went to sleep feeling incredibly peaceful. The next afternoon, Marcus walked into the lavish downtown offices of Apex Freight. They were a ruthless rival logistics firm and my biggest corporate competitor in the Southeast. Marcus set up an emergency meeting with their senior executive board, promising them the ultimate weapon to destroy my market dominance. He stood at the head of their glass conference table, wearing a cheap suit he desperately tried to iron in his motel room. He boldly demanded a $5 million cash payout in exchange for my proprietary client data. The rival executives were greedy and eager to crush my rapid expansion, so they agreed to inspect the files. Marcus proudly pulled a silver USB drive from his pocket and plugged it directly into the main presentation computer, connecting it to the rival firm's central network. He clicked on the master folder, expecting to display my confidential financial blueprints. The exact second he opened the file, my custom-built trap violently snapped shut. The presentation screen instantly flickered and turned blood red. A loud, blaring alarm sound erupted from the computer speakers. The aggressive ransomware Marcus had just unleashed ripped through the rival network with terrifying speed. Every computer monitor in the executive boardroom locked down simultaneously, displaying a bright red warning screen with my corporate logo right in the center. The rival executives watched in horror as their entire internal network was completely paralyzed in less than 30 seconds. The room erupted into total chaos. The rival chief executive officer shot up from his chair and screamed at Marcus, demanding to know what kind of cyber weapon he had deployed. Marcus stumbled backwards, staring at the red screens in sheer panic. He babbled incoherently, trying to explain the files were supposed to be financial records. The rival executives realized instantly that Marcus had not brought them valuable corporate secrets. He had brought them a catastrophic digital bomb and exposed their willingness to buy stolen data. The rival CEO grabbed his desk phone and shouted for building security to lock down the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at Marcus and vowed to hand him directly over to federal authorities for orchestrating an act of corporate cyber terrorism. I sat in my office miles away, watching the tracking software ping perfectly on my dashboard. I knew exactly where Marcus was and exactly what he had done. He thought he could outsmart me with a cheap trick, but he had just handed the industry undeniable proof of his own criminal espionage. He was permanently ruined. Marcus had just cemented his own destruction, and Beatrice watched her final hope of reclaiming the company vanish. She was completely unhinged and backed into a corner, but a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. Beatrice realized she could not beat me in a boardroom or a cyber war, so she decided to dig into the dirt. She needed immediate leverage, and she truly did not care how many laws she had to break to get it. She used the very last of her hidden cash reserves to hire a notoriously shady private investigator operating deep in Atlanta. This desperate investigator was well known among the struggling elite for playing incredibly dirty and acquiring restricted private information by any means necessary. Beatrice ordered him to ruthlessly tear through every single aspect of my personal past before I ever married Marcus. She desperately wanted something terribly scandalous to permanently destroy my pristine corporate reputation. The private investigator could not find any financial crimes or corporate misconduct because my professional record was absolutely flawless. However, he simply did not stop his search at checking public records. He took a massive illegal step and hacked directly into highly secure federal and state medical databases. This was a severe, unquestionable violation of strict federal health privacy laws, but Beatrice was far too desperate to care about the harsh legal consequences. He dug up the sealed hospital records belonging to my late mother. My mother had sadly passed away several years ago after a brutal, prolonged battle with a severe illness. The greedy investigator uncovered old financial documents showing that during her final agonizing months, my mother had accumulated massive, insurmountable medical debts. Beatrice thought she had just found the ultimate weapon to completely ruin my life. She took those illegally obtained private medical files and carefully crafted a vicious, twisted narrative. She planned to falsely frame me as a heartless, cruel corporate monster. Her fabricated story loudly claimed that I was a complete fraud who ruthlessly climbed the corporate ladder and paraded around Atlanta in expensive designer clothes, while intentionally leaving my own mother to suffer and die in absolute poverty. Beatrice knew very well that in the competitive world of high society and corporate philanthropy, public optics are absolutely everything. If the media published a story portraying me as a greedy daughter who hoarded millions while deliberately abandoning her dying mother in the South Atlanta slums, my carefully built public image would be instantly destroyed. My loyal clients would be utterly disgusted, and my newly established board of directors would surely force me to immediately step down in disgrace. She did not wait a single passing second to use her brand new dangerous leverage against me. I was calmly sitting in my quiet office reviewing the final acquisition paperwork of a new transport fleet when my private cell phone abruptly rang. It was Beatrice, calling from a blocked number. She did not even bother with any fake polite greetings today. She immediately launched right into her incredibly vile blackmail attempt. She told me she currently held physical copies of my mother, sealed medical records, and private debt collection notices. She slowly read a few of the highly sensitive personal medical details out loud, just to prove she was not making a bluff. My stomach violently dropped, not out of fear for my professional career, but out of pure, absolute disgust that she would dare violate my late mother's privacy like that. Beatrice gloated with the sickeningly sweet, triumphant tone. She told me that she had already drafted a terrible press release and had a corrupt contact at a major local tabloid completely ready to publish the story right on the front page. She loudly promised to send the illegally obtained medical documents to every single one of my vital corporate clients and wealthy investors. Then she confidently laid out her massive extortion demands. She demanded that I completely reverse the corporate takeover today and return her beloved Savannah vacation estate by the end of the week. She told me I had to publicly resign as the head of the company and transfer all my valuable equity directly back to Marcus. In exchange for fully surrendering my entire empire, she promised to keep the medical documents hidden away and remain totally silent about my past. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I had to flawlessly play the part of a terrified, completely defeated woman. I purposely let my breathing become extremely rapid and shaky. I lowered my voice to a frantic, desperate whisper and begged her, please, not to release those sensitive files to the public. I practically pleaded with her, telling her that a massive scandal like this would permanently ruin my successful mergers and acquisitions firm. I acted as though I was completely cornered and perfectly willing to surrender everything just to protect my hard-earned public image. I told Beatrice that I would happily give her back the logistics company and the sprawling estate, but I begged her not to do anything rash. Beatrice laughed a deeply evil, triumphant laugh through the speaker. She told me it was about time I remembered my proper place and submitted to my social betters. I nervously told her I absolutely needed to see the physical evidence before I signed any transfer papers. I asked her to bring every document the private investigator had stolen to a highly public meeting. I suggested we meet tomorrow evening at one of the most exclusive high-end restaurants in Buckhead. She told me to bring my lawyers and the signed deed to the Savannah property. I calmly hung up the phone and wiped the fake panic from my face. Beatrice thought she had just outsmarted me, but she had no idea she had just confessed to a federal crime on a recorded line. I smiled and quickly picked up my phone to make a very important call to some friends in federal law enforcement. The following evening, I walked into an exclusive steakhouse in Buckhead. The lighting was deliberately dim, creating an atmosphere of elite privilege. I wore a simple black dress and kept my makeup minimal, intentionally making myself look exhausted. Beatrice was already sitting at a private corner booth. She was radiating a sickening level of triumphant energy. She wore a bright crimson blazer, signaling her perceived victory. When she saw me approaching, she offered a wide, predatory smile. She genuinely believed she was about to take back her empire and put me back in the slums. I slid into the booth across from her and let my shoulders slump. I nervously folded my hands, playing the role of terrified prey perfectly. Beatrice signaled a waiter, ordering an expensive bottle of vintage champagne. She told him we had a special reunion to celebrate and waved him away. Once he disappeared, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She slammed it down on the polished mahogany table, keeping her hand resting firmly on top of it with a vicious gleam in her eyes. Beatrice began to gloat with a level of cruelty that was truly astounding. She whispered that inside this folder was the absolute destruction of my corporate existence. She declared she held printed copies of every unpaid hospital bill my late mother accumulated. She cruelly mocked my mother for dying in South Atlanta, while I supposedly hoarded wealth. She said she drafted a press release framing me as a fraud who abandoned her flesh and blood to climb the corporate ladder. She promised that if I did not sign over my equity in Sterling Logistics and hand back the deed to the Savannah estate by tomorrow morning, every major news outlet in Georgia would receive this folder. She leaned back, crossing her arms and looking at me with unadulterated hatred. I kept my head bowed, letting my voice tremble slightly as I asked to see the documents. I begged her to prove she actually had the files before I signed my life away. Beatrice laughed a sharp, wicked sound. She slid the heavy folder across the table, convinced she had won the war. I slowly opened the front cover, looking down at the medical records. I saw the familiar hospital letterheads, the detailed treatment logs, and the massive balances from years ago. Seeing my mother's private history weaponized made my blood boil, but I stayed calm. I stared at the papers for a long moment and let out a slow, relaxed exhale. I sat up perfectly straight in the booth and dropped the terrified victim act. My shoulders squared, my chin lifted, and I looked Beatrice dead in the eye with a calm, razor-sharp smile. The sudden drastic shift in my demeanor instantly unsettled her. Her triumphant smile faltered as confusion crept across her face. I reached into my purse and calmly pulled out a certified bank document, placing it directly on top of her stolen files. I politely invited Beatrice to read the highlighted section. I watched her eyes dart downward and scan the text. The color rapidly drained from her face. I explained in a steady voice that I never abandoned my mother. I told her that the very second my corporate investments began generating substantial profit 5 years ago, I completely paid off those medical debts. The hospital accounts had been fully settled and closed for years. Beatrice began to stutter, completely thrown off balance. She pointed at her folder and argued. The private investigator swore the debts were real, and that the leaked files would still ruin me. I shook my head, laughing softly. I told Beatrice she was missing the larger picture. I explained that her desperate attempt to ruin my reputation was entirely irrelevant now. The actual problem was the exact method her shady private investigator used to acquire those sealed documents. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I informed Beatrice that the United States government takes federal health privacy laws incredibly seriously. I explained that illegally hacking secure federal medical databases to steal patient records is a massive federal crime. I told her that by bringing these stolen physical documents to a public extortion meeting, she had just elevated herself from a bitter mother-in-law to an active participant in a major criminal conspiracy. Beatrice tried to snatch the folder back, but I firmly planted my hand on top of it. She gasped loudly, threatening to leave the restaurant immediately. I calmly raised my left wrist and pressed a single button on my smartwatch. Less than 2 seconds later, the men sitting in the booth directly behind Beatrice stood up. They were not regular restaurant patrons. They were 2 federal agents wearing dark suits and carrying official badges. They stepped out of the shadows, flanking Beatrice on both sides, blocking her completely in the booth. One of the federal agents reached down and swiftly confiscated the manila folder from the table. The other agent firmly instructed Beatrice to hand over her cell phone immediately. Beatrice began to hyperventilate. Her eyes darted wildly around the restaurant, but nobody was coming to help her. She realized with crushing clarity that I had never been scared of her blackmail attempt. I had lured her to this high-end restaurant to ensure she handed physical evidence of a federal crime directly over to law enforcement in a public setting. She had walked blindly and foolishly straight into a federal trap. The agents informed her she was now a primary suspect in a federal cybercrime and extortion investigation. They told her that her private investigator was already in custody and had eagerly flipped on her to secure a plea deal. Beatrice slumped back against the leather booth, looking entirely broken and terrified as the agent secured her phone in an evidence bag. She had tried to destroy my professional life, but she had just permanently ended her own. With Beatrice sitting in federal custody, completely stripped of her social armor and her extortion plot dismantled, I turned my attention back to the digital goldmine Vanessa sold me. Marcus Burner Phone had given me the offshore trust documents linking Connor to the Cayman Islands money laundering scheme. My cybersecurity team had cracked into a deeply hidden encrypted messaging app on the device. When my tech director pulled up the recovered chat logs, I actually had to laugh out loud at the absolute depravity of the Sterling family dynamic. The messages were not between Marcus and his business partners. They were between Connor and Vanessa. Marcus' arrogant white brother-in-law and his fake pregnant 24-year-old mistress had been sleeping together for the past 6 months. Connor had been funding Vanessa luxury apartment and designer handbags right under Marcus' nose. They were using Marcus as a convenient distraction while they plotted to siphon the Sterling family wealth for themselves. But now their grand master plan was completely falling apart. The Cayman Islands trust account was frozen by the Internal Revenue Service. Beatrice was facing federal extortion charges. Chloe had publicly melted down at the motel, and Marcus was radioactive. Connor and Vanessa realized with terrifying clarity that the federal authorities were actively handing out arrest warrants, and their names were absolutely next on the list. They were facing decades in federal prison and total financial bankruptcy. Cornered rats always make desperate moves, and these 2 were no exception. My private investigators had maintained continuous surveillance on the cheap motel where the remaining Sterling family members were staying. The live feed showed Connor sneaking back into Beatrice's empty room while she was busy getting arrested at the steakhouse. He went straight for the loose floorboard under the sagging motel bed. Beatrice managed to smuggle one final asset out of the Buckhead mansion during the eviction. It was a velvet lockbox containing over $2 million in untraceable heirloom diamonds and vintage emeralds. Connor ruthlessly smashed the box open, dumped the priceless family jewels into a leather duffel bag, and ran out to a waiting rideshare vehicle. Vanessa was sitting in the back seat. They pooled the last of their stolen cash to purchase 2 first-class one-way tickets to Dubai. The United Arab Emirates does not have a standing extradition treaty with the United States for certain white-collar crimes. Connor and Vanessa thought they were executing the perfect midnight escape. They genuinely believed they could steal Beatrice's last remaining lifeline, flee the country, and live like absolute royalty in the Middle East while leaving Chloe and Marcus to rot in a federal penitentiary. They completely forgot who was watching the surveillance feeds the moment my security director flagged the flight confirmation to Dubai. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to the federal agents handling the Cayman Islands wire fraud case. I calmly provided them with Connor's exact flight itinerary, his terminal number, and his status as a severe international flight risk holding stolen untraceable assets. The Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately coordinated with the Transportation Security Administration and the local police. Connor and Vanessa arrived at the international airport radiating pure, arrogant confidence. They checked their bags, breezed through the first-class security line, and made their way to the international departure terminal. My investigator was trailing them, blending perfectly into the crowded concourse. He transmitted a live video feed directly to my office monitor. I watched Connor and Vanessa sit at a high-end airport lounge, sipping overpriced champagne and laughing. They were clinking their glasses together, celebrating their successful escape, and toasting to the absolute destruction of the Sterling family. When the boarding announcement for the flight to Dubai echoed over the terminal speakers, Connor proudly grabbed the leather duffel bag filled with stolen diamonds. He took Vanessa by the hand, and they strutted toward the boarding gate, acting like untouchable billionaires. They handed their first-class tickets to the gate agent and took a step onto the jet bridge. They did not even make it 3 feet. Suddenly, a dozen heavily armed federal agents and plainclothes police officers swarmed the jet bridge from every single direction. The coordinated ambush was swift and absolutely brutal. 2 agents grabbed Connor by the shoulders, sweeping his legs out from under him and driving him face first into the airport carpet. The heavy leather duffel bag flew out of his hands, spilling brilliant diamond necklaces and emerald rings all over the boarding area. At the exact same time, 3 female officers tackled Vanessa, pinning her against the glass wall of the terminal and forcefully pulling her arms behind her back. The smug, confident smiles vanished from their faces, instantly replaced by sheer, raw terror. The heavy metal handcuffs clicked tightly around their wrists. The moment the Miranda rights were read, the treacherous couple turned on each other with blinding speed. Connor started screaming at the top of his lungs that the stolen jewelry belonged entirely to Vanessa and that she had masterminded the entire escape plan. He yelled that he was just a victim of her manipulation. Vanessa violently thrashed against the officers, screaming back that Connor was a massive federal money launderer who had forged offshore bank documents to frame his own wife. She loudly offered to tell the federal agents absolutely everything about his illegal shell companies if they'd just let her go. I sat in my penthouse office watching the live feed as they viciously tore each other apart in front of hundreds of shocked international travelers. They were forcefully dragged away from the boarding gate in shiny steel handcuffs, screaming endless criminal accusations at one another as they disappeared down the concourse. I took a slow, satisfied sip of my coffee. The ultimate betrayal had just delivered them straight into a federal prison cell. The spectacular arrest of Connor and Vanessa at the international departure gate left one massive loose end completely unraveling back at the cheap roadside motel. While her treacherous husband and his pregnant mistress sat in federal holding cells waiting for their arraignments, the crushing reality of the situation came crashing down on the woman they left behind. Chloe was completely penniless, abandoned, and terrified. The local police had briefly detained her after the motel lobby brawl, but they released her when the federal agents took over the offshore money laundering investigation. The federal prosecutors made it very clear to Chloe that her signature was all over the Cayman Islands trust documents. Unless she could mount a multi-million-dollar legal defense to prove those signatures were forged by Connor, she was looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe had absolutely no money to hire a defense attorney. Her bank accounts were frozen, her credit cards were declined, and her mother Beatrice had just spent her last dime trying to desperately flee her own criminal extortion charges. Chloe had spent her entire 30 years of life wrapped in a bubble of aristocratic privilege. She was a woman who once bragged about spending $50,000 on a single shopping trip in Paris. Now she was facing decades in a concrete cell for a financial crime her white knight husband committed while he was secretly sleeping with her brother mistress. The absolute devastation of her reality completely broke her spirit. Stripped of her designer clothes and her elitist pride, she realized there was exactly one person in the entire city of Atlanta who had the power and the evidence to save her. The next morning, I was sitting in my penthouse enjoying a fresh cup of espresso when my lobby security guard called my private line. He informed me that a frantic, disheveled woman, claiming to be my sister-in-law, was crying at the front desk, begging to see me. I took a slow sip of my coffee and instructed the guard to send her up the private elevator. The polished steel doors slid open a few minutes later, and Chloe stumbled into my grand foyer. She was an absolute wreck. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled, her makeup was heavily smeared down her cheeks, and she was still wearing the exact same wrinkled clothes she wore during the motel fight. The fake sophisticated grace she had practiced for decades had vanished entirely. She looked exactly like the desperate, broken woman she truly was. Chloe did not even try to maintain her dignity. The moment she saw me standing by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, she collapsed onto her knees right on my cold marble floor. She began sobbing hysterically, clutching her face and pleading with me for help. She begged me for a loan to hire a criminal defense lawyer. She cried that Connor had completely ruined her life and that the federal agents were going to arrest her by the end of the week. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, asking me to please use my corporate influence to explain to the authorities that she was totally innocent regarding the Cayman Islands wire fraud. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not walk over to comfort her. I simply stood there holding my espresso cup, looking down at her with absolute cold indifference. I let her cry on the floor for several minutes, letting the suffocating silence of the penthouse amplify her humiliation. When she finally ran out of breath and looked up at me, waiting for a response, I delivered a brutally honest reality check. I calmly reminded Chloe of every single time she went out of her way to make me feel worthless. I brought up the extravagant country club dinners where she loudly mocked my South Atlanta background for her wealthy friends to hear. I reminded her how she constantly told Marcus he was completely out of his mind for marrying a low-class girl with no generational wealth. I asked her where all that superior, aristocratic sterling pride was right now. I told her it was incredibly poetic that the very same woman she treated like garbage for 5 years was now the only person standing between her and a federal prison uniform. Chloe lowered her head and quietly sobbed, admitting that she had been incredibly cruel and foolish. She whispered that she deserved my anger, but she begged me not to let her go to prison for Connor crimes. I slowly walked over to my glass coffee table and set my espresso cup down. I told Chloe that I actually had a team of elite corporate lawyers who could easily prove Connor forged every single one of those offshore bank documents. I told her I had the exact digital evidence from Marcus' burner phone that proved Connor intended to frame her from the very beginning. I revealed that I could secure her complete federal immunity from the money laundering charges by tomorrow morning. I even offered to cut her a modest severance check from the company corporate funds, just enough money for her to rent a cheap, quiet apartment and start a brand new life, far away from the elite circles of Atlanta. Chloe's eyes lit up with sheer desperate hope. She nodded frantically, thanking me profusely and reaching out as if to grab my hand. I immediately took a step back and raised my finger, stopping her dead in her tracks. I clearly explained that my generous lifeline came with one absolute non-negotiable condition. I told Chloe she had to earn her freedom through ultimate betrayal. I informed her that Beatrice and Marcus were currently using their cheap defense attorneys to file aggressive fraudulent claims against my corporate takeover in civil court. They were still desperately trying to lie under oath and pretend I manipulated the logistics company out from under them. I told Chloe that if she wanted my protection from the federal government, she had to officially turn state evidence. She had to walk into that civil courtroom, take the witness stand under oath, and systematically destroy her own mother and brother. She had to publicly testify about every single illegal scheme, Marcus' gambling debts, and Beatrice's ongoing criminal conspiracies. She had to be the one to drive the final nail into the Sterling family coffin. Chloe sat frozen on the marble floor, processing the magnitude of what I was demanding. She had to choose between protecting the miserable remnants of her toxic family or saving herself from a lifetime behind bars. The decision did not take long. The loyalty she once held for her mother and brother had already been completely shattered by their collective greed. She slowly looked up at me, wiping the smeared makeup from her eyes. With a shaky, defeated voice, Chloe nodded her head and agreed to testify against them. She surrendered entirely, betraying her own bloodline to save herself. I smiled, knowing the courtroom showdown was going to be an absolute massacre. 3 weeks later, the heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Civil Courthouse swung open, marking the beginning of the end for the Sterling family. We were there for the final civil hearing regarding the legal restructuring of Sterling Logistics. Marcus and Beatrice had filed a massive fraudulent lawsuit, desperately claiming that my corporate takeover was entirely illegal. They wanted the judge to reverse the debt conversion and hand the 60-year-old logistics empire right back to them. I sat calmly at the plaintiff table, wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, flanked by 3 of the most expensive and ruthless corporate litigators in the state of Georgia. Directly across the wide center aisle sat Marcus and Beatrice. They had clearly spent the last of their borrowed cash on a desperate public relations strategy. Beatrice had completely abandoned her usual flashy diamonds and aggressive designer gowns. Instead, she wore a muted, modest gray dress with a simple string of pearls, purposely trying to look like a frail, helpless elderly woman. Marcus wore a conservative suit and kept his head bowed, playing the role of a devastated, heartbroken son. The trial began, and Beatrice was the very first person to be called to the witness stand. She raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and immediately began to lie through her teeth. She put on a truly Oscar-worthy performance for the presiding judge. She produced fake tears, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, as she described me as a ruthless, calculating predator. She falsely testified that I had intentionally preyed on her vulnerable son, weaving a complex web of deceit to steal their cherished generational wealth. She claimed I had forged the Apex Capital debt documents and manipulated the company financial records out from under them, while they were completely blind to my malicious schemes. She painted a pathetic picture of a proud, hard-working Atlanta family utterly destroyed by a greedy outsider. Marcus took the stand right after his mother. He looked directly at the judge and spun an even more elaborate web of absolute fiction. He claimed that the massive cryptocurrency losses were actually my fault. He lied under oath, stating that I had forced him to take out the toxic loans and then intentionally locked him out of the corporate banking portals so he would default. He tried to sound like a noble, dedicated chief executive officer who was simply outsmarted by a vindictive ex-wife. He begged the judge to restore his rightful place at the head of the company and save his family legacy from ruin. The judge listened intently, taking detailed notes and occasionally looking over at my table with a skeptical expression. Beatrice and Marcus looked extremely smug when their discount defense attorney finally rested their case. They genuinely believed they had successfully manipulated the court with their pathetic victim routine. My lead corporate attorney stood up slowly and buttoned his suit jacket. He did not bother cross-examining Marcus or Beatrice. He calmly addressed the judge and announced that we would like to call a surprise rebuttal witness to the stand. He formally requested the bailiff to bring in Chloe Sterling. The smug, confident smiles instantly melted off the faces of Marcus and Beatrice. They whipped their heads around to stare at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. The doors pushed open, and Chloe walked down the center aisle. She was not wearing her usual flashy high society brands. She wore a plain, dark pantsuit, looking pale, exhausted, and entirely broken. She did not look at her mother or her brother as she walked past their defense table. She walked straight up to the witness stand, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Marcus' attorney immediately jumped up and loudly objected, claiming this was an unfair ambush, but the judge sternly overruled him, demanding to hear what the witness had to say. My attorney approached the stand and began a highly methodical surgical questioning. Chloe took a deep, shaky breath and completely unleashed the absolute truth. She systematically destroyed every single lie her mother and brother had just told under oath. She detailed exactly how Marcus had secretly gambled away millions of company dollars on offshore crypto accounts long before I ever stepped in to audit the books. She testified that Beatrice was completely aware of the financial ruin and had actively helped Marcus hide the massive debts from the shareholders. The courtroom was dead silent as Chloe continued to dismantle her own bloodline. She exposed the deliberate illegal schemes Beatrice had orchestrated to try and frame me. She told the judge about the fake charity donations, the desperate attempts to blackmail me with my late mother medical records, and the vile plan to use Vanessa's fake pregnancy to force me out of the mansion. She clearly stated that my corporate takeover was entirely legal, and that it was the only thing that saved the logistics company from total bankruptcy. She looked right at the judge and confessed that her family was completely toxic, driven entirely by greed, arrogance, and a desperate need to maintain a fake aristocratic image at any cost. Marcus could not handle the exposure. Watching his own sister publicly annihilate his fake victim narrative completely shattered his fragile ego. He violently lost his mind right in the middle of the civil courtroom. He jumped up from his chair, knocking it backward with a loud crash. He lunged toward the witness stand, pointing a shaking finger directly at Chloe. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, calling her a traitor, a liar, and a pathetic coward. He yelled that she was dead to him and threatened to destroy her the second they stepped out of the building. His face was bright red with blinding, unhinged rage, and spittle flew from his mouth as he completely dropped his calm, victimized facade. The judge aggressively banged his wooden gavel, demanding order in the court. He ordered the armed bailiffs to immediately restrain Marcus and force him back into his seat. Marcus continued to thrash and shout, proving his incredibly unstable and aggressive nature to the entire room. The judge glared down from the bench, absolutely furious at the massive disrespect shown to his courtroom. Beatrice sat frozen in her chair, covering her mouth with her trembling hands, realizing that Marcus' explosive outburst had just provided undeniable physical proof of everything Chloe had testified about. They had walked into the courtroom hoping to play the innocent elite victims, but Marcus had just shown the judge exactly who the Sterling family truly was. I sat quietly at the plaintiff table, watching the beautiful, satisfying implosion unfold exactly as I had planned. The civil trial was practically over, and the final fatal blow was just moments away. The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel against the sound block, and the sharp crack echoed like a gunshot across the room. He demanded absolute silence from the defense table. Marcus was breathing heavily, his suit jacket rumpled, and his face flushed purple with rage. The armed bailiffs kept their hands firmly on his shoulders, forcing him to remain seated. The judge looked down from his elevated bench with an expression of pure disgust. He stated that in 30 years of civil litigation, he had never witnessed such a blatant display of arrogance, perjury, and entitlement. He looked directly at Beatrice, who was trembling in her chair, and told her that her attempt to manipulate the justice system was an absolute disgrace. The judge formally announced his final ruling without hesitation. He completely dismissed their fraudulent lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they could never attempt to sue me over the corporate takeover again. He legally validated my 65% majority ownership and formally recognized me as the sole legitimate chief executive officer of Sterling Logistics, my lead attorney stood up and politely requested one final protective measure. He asked the court to grant a permanent restraining order and a corporate injunction against both Marcus and Beatrice. The judge did not ask for defense arguments. He immediately granted the request. He issued a strict binding legal order permanently, barring Marcus and Beatrice from ever contacting me directly or indirectly. They were legally prohibited from stepping foot within 1,000 feet of the corporate headquarters or any of my affiliated properties. Furthermore, he ordered them to pay every single penny of my legal fees associated with this ridiculous trial. Beatrice suddenly found her voice. She stood up on shaky legs, clutching her pearl necklace, and tried to play the fragile elderly victim one last time. She begged the judge to show some mercy, claiming they were bankrupt and had nowhere to go. She cried that they had already lost their Savannah estate and their Buckhead mansion. The judge stared at her with zero sympathy. He coldly reminded her that courts do not issue discounts for extreme malicious greed. He banged his gavel one final time and adjourned the civil proceedings. Beatrice let out a long, defeated breath, believing the absolute worst was finally over. She genuinely thought she could just walk out of the courthouse and slink back to her miserable motel room to plot another minor revenge. She was entirely wrong. Just as the court reporter finished typing the transcript, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The timing was absolutely flawless. 5 federal marshals wearing dark tactical vests and carrying warrants marched down the center aisle. They were accompanied by 2 plainclothes agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from a civil dispute into a high-stakes criminal takedown. The lead federal marshal walked straight past the wooden barricade and stopped directly in front of the defense table. He looked down at Marcus and ordered him to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Marcus froze, his eyes darting frantically around the room. The marshal loudly announced that Marcus was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He listed the devastating charges one by one so everyone in the gallery could hear Marcus was indicted for severe corporate espionage, interstate wire fraud, and deploying ransomware cyber attacks against a rival logistics firm. Marcus tried to back away, but the bailiffs who were already standing behind him simply grabbed his arms and shoved him forward. The steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. He immediately started hyperventilating, losing his mind. The arrogant executive who had spent 5 years treating me like a worthless charity case completely shattered. He started sobbing uncontrollably in the middle of the courtroom. Tears streamed down his face as he desperately looked at his mother. He began begging and crying out for her like a terrified little boy, pleading with her to use her social connections to make the federal agents go away. Beatrice could not help him because a second federal agent had just stepped directly in front of her. The agent pulled out a set of handcuffs and informed Beatrice that she was also placed under federal arrest. He read her charges with a loud, booming voice. Beatrice was officially indicted for criminal conspiracy, severe extortion, and multiple federal health privacy violations regarding the illegal hacking of my late mother's sealed medical records. The agent told her that her private investigator had already provided a full written confession detailing her exact orders. Beatrice realized her entire world was over. She was a destitute woman about to spend her last decades rotting inside a federal penitentiary. Her high society friends would read about her criminal downfall in the morning papers, faced with total destruction. Beatrice decided to perform one desperate theatrical stunt. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutched her chest with both hands, and allowed her eyes to roll back into her head. She collapsed directly onto the hard floor, expecting the room to rush to her aid. She waited for paramedics to be called and for the agents to show sympathy. Absolutely. Nobody moved. The judge remained seated at his bench, watching her pathetic performance with absolute boredom. The marshals simply stood over her, holding her arrest warrant, waiting for her to open her eyes. Chloe remained seated in the witness box, looking down at her mother with pure disgust before quietly walking out the side door. I stood up from the plaintiff table and buttoned my charcoal suit jacket. I picked up my briefcase and stepped out from behind the wooden barrier. I walked slowly down the center aisle, passing my sobbing ex-husband and my mother-in-law, who was still faking a medical emergency on the floor. I pushed open the heavy doors and walked out into the bright, warm Atlanta afternoon, leaving the ruined family behind forever. The courtroom doors had barely closed before reality slammed into Beatrice. The judge ordered her and Marcus to pay complete restitution and cover every penny of my legal fees. For a family surviving entirely on stolen corporate funds, that financial mandate was a death sentence. Beatrice desperately tried to liquidate her assets, but the federal government had already frozen her accounts. Her criminal defense attorneys demanded massive cash retainers. When her checks bounced, those elite lawyers immediately dropped her case, leaving her with a public defender. With no stolen corporate profits to lean on, Beatrice was utterly ruined. Her final asset was a luxury penthouse condo located in downtown Atlanta. She purchased it years ago using the logistics company funds. It was her last remaining fortress of aristocratic pride. However, she had taken out multiple secondary mortgages to fund her lavish lifestyle. When she defaulted, the bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings. Beatrice thought she could stall the bank with endless legal filings. She genuinely believed her social status would grant her an extension. She was wrong. As an acquisitions expert, I monitored distressed properties belonging to my enemies with precision. The moment her condo debt was auctioned off, I directed my firm to purchase the portfolio. I bought the rights to her final sanctuary for pennies on the dollar. I became her sole creditor, and I had zero interest in offering a payment plan. I initiated the final eviction protocols the very next morning. The morning of the eviction was brisk and perfectly clear. The bright Atlanta sun reflected off the towering glass buildings downtown. I arrived at her condominium complex at exactly 8 in the morning, holding a warm cup of coffee. I wore a tailored green trench coat projecting total unbothered authority. 2 county sheriffs met me in the marble lobby, holding the official eviction mandate. We rode the private elevator up to the top floor in total silence. When the steel doors slid open, the sheriffs did not bother knocking politely. They banged their heavy fists against the mahogany door, announcing their presence and demanding immediate entry. I stood back, taking a slow sip of my coffee, waiting for the show to begin. The door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked nothing like the arrogant matriarch who had thrown divorce papers in my face. Beatrice stood in the doorway, looking completely hollowed out. Her face was pale and drawn, devoid of the expensive cosmetics she usually wore like armor. The pristine silver hair that she used to get professionally styled twice a week hung limp and tangled around her shoulders. She was wearing a faded vintage Chanel suit, but the luxurious fabric was heavily wrinkled and stained. The matching pearl necklace she always wore to assert her dominance was entirely missing, likely pawned weeks ago to pay for a cheap motel room or a hot meal. The county sheriff stepped into the penthouse and sternly informed Beatrice that she had exactly 10 minutes to gather her essential personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately. They handed her a single medium-sized cardboard box and told her that everything else inside the condo now legally belonged to the property holding company, which was me. Beatrice's hands shook violently as she took the cheap brown box. She did not scream or throw a dramatic tantrum like she had in the courtroom. The fight had been completely drained out of her. She wandered through the grand rooms of her penthouse, aimlessly tossing a few wrinkled blouses, some basic toiletries, and a single framed photograph into the cardboard box. Her movements were slow and robotic. She looked around at the expensive artwork, the crystal chandeliers, and the custom-imported furniture she was being forced to leave behind forever. All the material possessions she had worshipped her entire life were being stripped away in an instant. When her 10 minutes were up, the sheriffs placed their hands on her shoulders and firmly guided her out into the hallway. They locked the heavy mahogany door behind her, securing the property. Beatrice clutched the cardboard box tightly against her chest as we all rode the elevator down to the ground floor. She kept her head bowed, refusing to look in my direction. When we reached the bustling downtown street, the reality of her total isolation became glaringly obvious. There were no luxury town cars waiting for her at the curb. There were no loyal high society friends rushing to offer her a guest house. She had burned every single bridge she ever built. We stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. I stood on the elevated concrete steps of the building entrance holding my coffee. Beatrice walked down to the curb and finally turned around to face me. The morning sunlight illuminated the deep lines of exhaustion on her face. She looked up at me and her eyes burned with pure, unadulterated hatred. She despised me for dismantling her fake empire and exposing her as a fraud. She wanted me to gloat so she could play the victim one last time. I did not give her that satisfaction. I simply looked down at her and offered a polite, slow, dismissive nod. It was the exact same arrogant nod she had given me on the night she tried to throw me out of the Buckhead mansion. A loud, screeching noise broke the silence as a dirty, crowded city bus pulled up to the curb right behind her. The doors hissed open. Beatrice turned around, gripping her single cardboard box tightly. She climbed the steep rubber steps of the bus, paying her fare with a handful of loose coins. She found an empty plastic seat near the back and sat down, staring blankly ahead. The heavy doors slammed shut and the bus pulled away, merging into the heavy downtown traffic. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the dark exhaust fumes dissipate into the clear morning air as Beatrice drove away into total, permanent obscurity forever.